The term narcissism was, until quite recently, largely confined to the diagnostic categories of psychology. Now, however, it is becoming a very widely used term, almost a household word, descriptive of a certain set of dysfunctional traits and behaviours in relationships. Whether this is because narcissism is on the rise, or whether we are better equipped to identify the condition due to increased psychological understanding, there is undeniably a wave of it sweeping across the planet right now that has reached pandemic proportions. And narcissistic interactions are not confined to relationships between individuals. They also occur in relationships between larger social units, between, for example, a ruling elite and its people, between ethnicities, nations, and between human society and the planet as a whole. How we relate to the Earth, of which we are all an intrinsic part, has never really been considered as a factor in the rise of the current COVID pandemic, at least not through the media platform of the ruling elite. We are concerned with how the virus emerged and how we deal with it, but not many seem to be asking the why question. And yet, current research does strongly suggest that adverse environmental factors, when the Earth is under stress, are indicated in the emergence and transmission of viruses. Admittedly, the Earth does seem to undergo certain cyclic environmental changes in temperature, sea levels, and so on, with or without the presence of humans. But there is now overwhelming evidence that environmental pollution caused by humans is significantly exacerbating the declining conditions on this planet. When considering the kind of mindset that would knowingly harm and exploit its planetary home without regard to the future well-being of even its own offspring, merely for the purposes of inflating its own ego, we are surely dealing with a narcissistic mindset. Surely then, if planetary conditions contribute to the arising of viruses, then we should look at the mindset that created the conditions. So what does the narcissistic mindset look like? The psychological professions usually describe narcissism as occurring along a sliding scale, with most people displaying several of a particular set of traits to some degree. There comes a point on this scale, however, where these traits become significantly dysfunctional and have a notably negative impact on those the person is in relationship with. This is the point where narcissism becomes one of several personality disorders, narcissistic personality disorder or NPD. The traits include the following: grandiosity. A person with NPD persistently engages in fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, or having the perfect mate, and insist on having the best of everything. They often come across as arrogant or haughty, conceited, boastful, and pretentious. They have an exaggerated sense of self-importance, believing that they are in some way superior or special, even though they often exaggerate their achievements and talents and are only able to associate with equally special people. They tend to monopolize conversations and look down on people they perceive as inferior, frequently showing contempt for or belittling others to make themselves appear superior. Indeed, their relationships tend to be superficial and exploitative, with the narcissist taking advantage of others to get what they want. A person with NPD has an excessive need for admiration and a strong sense of entitlement, expecting unquestioning compliance with their expectations. They easily feel slighted and find it almost impossible to handle criticism. They generally find it difficult to regulate their emotions and behaviours. In fact, they can become impatient or angry to the point of rage when they don't receive special treatment. A person with NPD generally lacks empathy and displays an inability or an unwillingness to recognise the needs and feelings of others. They usually harbour secret feelings of insecurity, shame, vulnerability and humiliation, and can often feel depressed and moody, because they fall short of their own ideal of perfection. They can also experience chronic feelings of emptiness and boredom. They are frequently envious of others, but at the same time believe and wish that other people envied them. So prevalent is narcissism that a whole terminology has emerged, shared by professionals and lay people alike, to describe certain typical narcissistic traits, whether to the level of NPD or not. First of all, we have narcissistic supply. This refers to the constant requirement by the narcissist for the recognition and acceptance by those they come into contact with of their special ego identity. This could be described as a false ego or a second layer of ego that they have created for themselves, very largely unconsciously, to protect the fragile and damaged ego that they can barely admit to themselves, let alone to other people. In order to get other people to provide narcissistic supply, narcissists will often love bomb their victims, at least initially. They will, that is, turn you into a special person by showering you with compliments, gifts, favours, and so on. This is what very often makes narcissists so charming and charismatic. Not that there is anything wrong with compliments, gifts, and favours, but for the narcissist, since they do not really care about you, except in relation to themselves, how you can enhance or benefit the narcissist, they always serve an ulterior purpose and might feel to you slightly excessive or inappropriate in some way, at least in hindsight. After the love bombing, they might start to find fault with you more and more frequently. Basically, they want to have power over your emotional state, to provoke a reaction in you, and ultimately lower your self-esteem. One of the tactics they use to gain power over others is triangulation. This is where they play other people off against each other, basically as a divide and rule strategy, where the narcissist remains in a central position of power between people who are in some way distanced or alienated from one another. The psychological template for triangulating behaviour is most likely laid down in childhood by a narcissistic parent, where the parent treats their children quite differently, one being the golden child and one being the scapegoat, bearing in mind that this can also happen when there are more than two children. The golden child is usually the one who buys into the family dynamic without question, and the scapegoat is the one who somehow questions it, consciously or unconsciously. One way of achieving triangulation, whether it be in a family relationship, an intimate relationship, in a friendship, in a work environment, or wherever, is through the use of flying monkeys. These are the other people the narcissist uses against you. And since the narcissist is very inventive, there are countless ways in which this can be done. It could be by poisoning the minds of others against you through gossiping or even lying, or perhaps by saying something negative about you to one or more people within your sphere of acquaintance, exaggerating some minor personality flaw of yours, and we all have those, out of all proportion. For example, if you have had a disagreement with a narcissist, the narcissist will take one thing you have said or done and turn this into the centerpiece of the situation, magnifying it out of all proportion, and at the same time greatly minimizing or removing altogether anything they may have said or done, and certainly missing out whatever they said or did to provoke you in the first place. We all know the cliched complaint of the domestic abuser, "Look what you made me do." You might then find that people who have been told these things have a different attitude towards you or ignore you completely, and you are left wondering what the hell you've done. Another way that the narcissist uses flying monkeys is by telling you the negative things other people say about you, but perhaps taking it completely out of context or omitting to say that the other person's opinion was largely based on what the narcissist had told them in the first place. Another tactic, often used to avoid being rumbled, but generally to disempower you, is gaslighting. This term is borrowed from the 1944 film Gaslight, which follows a young woman whose husband slowly manipulates her into believing she is descending into insanity. He does this because he hopes to gain power of attorney over her and have her institutionalized so that he can search undisturbed for and steal some valuable jewelry which has been hidden by her dead aunt in the attic. Jealous and accusatory when others show interest in her, the first thing he does is to isolate her from the outside world, telling her it is for her own good because of her strange behaviour. He removes pictures from the wall, but tells her she has taken and hidden them. She mentions an incriminating letter, which he denies ever existed. She hears footsteps in the attic and sees the gaslights dim and brighten for no apparent reason, which he says is all in her imagination, although the footsteps are his, as it turns out, as he looks for the jewellery and causes the gaslights to waver. Communications with narcissists can make you feel like you are going crazy. A common scenario is for the narcissist to fly into a rage about something they have most likely started, make you react with anger, and then when they calm down, tell you that you started it and you are the one that got angry. They might even go to great extremes to analyse the situation, but if you find you can't follow their convoluted logic and your brain feels fuzzy, then be sure you are being gaslighted. If you have managed to stay grey rock with the narcissist, to stay in a neutral state of calm, non-attachment that is, it can be interesting to observe their strategies. You might notice, for example, that if there has been a disagreement between you and the narcissist has flown into an unwarranted and disproportionate rage while you have stayed calm, even if there have been witnesses, the narcissist cannot take much of the blame and will almost certainly try to make you share it with them. We're as bad as each other. We both need to work on ourselves. This is undoubtedly true in that none of us is perfect. We all need to work on ourselves as part of the evolutionary drive to become better versions of ourselves. The likelihood is, however, that you have taken responsibility for your imperfections, whereas the narcissist would feel far too existentially threatened to be able to do this. It is always everyone else's fault, never theirs. Just to complicate matters further, there are various subtypes of the disorder, but very broadly speaking, there are two main manifestations, the overt and the covert narcissist. Although the two types share many of the same characteristics, the overt or grandiose type, which is described in the account above, tends to be arguably less insidious than the covert type, as it forgoes the grandiosity of the overt type and can even exhibit some sensitivity to others and is therefore more difficult to identify and deal with. So what causes NPD, whether overt or covert, and what is actually going on in the psyche of the narcissistic individual? As with most mental health disorders, the root causes are too complex to be pinpointed with any precision. It is likely that genetics, neurobiology, and early years life experiences, conditions, circumstances, and events all play a role. Broadly speaking, people with grandiose narcissism may well have been subjected to excessive and unhealthy adoration in childhood and treated as if they were superior to others, and as a result have developed the expectation that others should adore them and treat them as superior too, regardless of the obvious personality defects that all are susceptible to, especially those who have never had to self-examine. Those with covert narcissism are more likely to have been excessively criticised, neglected, or abused as children. Narcissistic behaviours help to protect them against feelings of inadequacy. It is difficult to say what exactly is going on in the psyche as the disorder develops, but it does seem as if both overt and covert narcissists have felt extremely threatened or vulnerable, or unable to be themselves in some way as children. Quite unconsciously, the traumatized ego begins to create a second layer of ego as a kind of defense mechanism. This second level ego represents the preferred self-image, which it is imagined will protect it from too close a scrutiny by self and others of the traumatized ego that lies just beneath the surface. Ironically, if the traumatized ego is fragile, then this second level of defense ego is even more so, having no real substance other than the fantasy in the narcissist's head, which the narcissist almost completely believes in and which others must believe in totally at all costs. You might be asking yourself at this point if you yourself are a narcissist, because you may have recognized several of the above traits in yourself. Be reassured that if you are asking this question with genuine concern, then you are unlikely to have NPD. Diagnostics are very useful in understanding the personality disorders which cause self and others so much difficulty. But as many psychologists maintain, this must be approached as a spectrum disorder, where most people to some extent are being narcissistic whenever they are thinking in terms of I rather than we. In fact, in some respects, the psychological diagnosis of NPD and the categorization of some people as narcissists and others not could be diverting many of us from a useful exercise in self-examination. It may also have masked the true meaning of the myth from which the psychological diagnostic has been derived. Myth tends to have universal application and describe the generalized human condition, rather than that of selected individuals. With its gods and goddesses, its nymphs and dryads, its symbolic narratives take us to a world which is beyond the limitations of our everyday three-dimensional reality, to a dimension where there is something deeply relevant to all human beings, psychologically and spiritually. As narcissism is so pertinent to the human condition at this time, let us look a bit more closely at the ancient Greek myth of Narcissus as recounted in Metamorphoses by the Roman poet Ovid, to see its wider implications for all of us. Narcissus was an extremely handsome young man, desired by many, but because of his pride unable to return their affections. One day the nymph Echo saw him hunting deer and fell madly in love with him. At that time she was not merely a voice, for she still had a body. Even so, she could only repeat the last words of what was spoken. This was a punishment from Juno, the queen of the gods, for intentionally keeping her in long and distracting conversations while other nymphs cavorted with her husband Jupiter in the mountains. When Narcissus became separated from his hunting companions, Echo, who could not tell him how she felt because of her affliction, emerged from the woods and went and put her arms around his neck. Pulling away from her, he told her to go away and leave him alone. Echo was so devastated and ashamed that she had been scorned in this way that she withdrew to the caves to live alone. So great was her sorrow at this rejection that her body eventually wasted away and vanished into the air. Only her voice remained to be heard repeating the last words of anyone calling out loudly enough in the hills. In the meantime, another of his scorned lovers appealed to the goddess Nemesis and asked that Narcissus too experience unrequited love. And so one day, Narcissus, resting from the hunt, lay down on the grass to drink from a pool of still water. Instead of quenching his thirst, however, he created another one, for as he drank, he was seized by the vision of his own reflected form. So beautiful it seemed to him that he fell madly in love with it and could not stir himself to move from that place and rejoin his hunting companions. Nothing could draw Narcissus away from the pool, where he lay gazing at that false image with unsated eyes, losing himself in his own vision. Eventually, however, he realized the truth of what was happening. I am he, I sense it, and I am not deceived by my own image. I am burning with love for myself. What shall I do? Little by little, Narcissus was weakened and worn away by the hidden fire. When Echo saw this, although she was still angered by memories of his rejection, she pitied him, and whenever Narcissus would call out alas, she repeated with her echoing voice, alas. Eventually, Narcissus laid down his weary head in the grass and died. His death was lamented by the naiads and dryads, and Echo returned their laments. But when they went to collect the body to prepare it for the funeral pyre, they found no body. Instead, they found a flower with white petals surrounding a yellow heart, the Narcissus flower. The term Narcissus refers to any of several flowering plants with white or yellow cup or trumpet-shaped flowers, notably the daffodil. It was borrowed via Latin from Greek, or possibly pre-Greek, Narcissus, and is related to the word narci, meaning numb, drugged, or sleep. This could be a reference not only to the intoxicating fragrance of some species, but also to its narcotic effects. Narci is the root of the word narcotic. The choice of this flower to illustrate the psychological meaning of the myth is not accidental, as we shall see. Most interpretations of the myth describe Narcissus' predicament as a tragic misreading of the perception of physical sight, and yet Narcissus himself tells us, "I am he, I sense it, and I am not deceived by my own image. I am burning with love for myself." He clearly knows that what he sees in the pool is merely a reflection. There is no other person lying just beneath the surface, mimicking his every move. So what does the myth mean symbolically? Narcissus has set himself apart from other people in the story. Physically, he withdraws from the hunt to rest by the pool by himself. Psychologically, he withdraws from his companions because no one is good enough for him. His peers also see him apart, as someone they can't connect with, disconnectedness being a core condition of the narcissistic psyche. Although there is often something attractive about the narcissist, it can sometimes feel as if you are dealing with a ghost, someone not quite there. Echo represents the person, the codependent in psychological terms, who cannot detach from the narcissist and whose self-esteem is so whittled away by spurned affection that they gradually become a shadow or an echo of their former self. And yet this myth is not just referring to someone with NPD. It is referring to anyone who believes his physical plane personality is all there is. Narcissus sees only his reflected physical image, his lower self, his ego self, and becomes excessively attached to it. He does not look within himself and find his true self, his higher self, which is the soul being characterized by love and interconnectedness. It applies basically to anyone who is not consciously awakening to the fact that they are a spiritual being having a temporary human experience. Anyone who is not consciously awakening to this reality, whose mortal personality does not recognize the immortal soul, is essentially in a narcotic trance, a state of narci, asleep to reality. The ultimate outcome of Narcissus' attachment to his material ego is that he turns into a flower and regresses in his evolution, the vegetable kingdom being of a lower order than the human and even the animal. Basically, narcissism is a kind of addiction to the materialist mindset, to materialism, to the psychophysical entity we call the personality. Or you could say it's a question of limited perspective, seeing life through a set of blinkers where consciousness is limited to the mundane level of reality, where everyone is separated from each other because they are separated from the one source which connects everything, the one source which can only be accessed through the soul, the real or higher self. Although it should be pointed out that one of the worst kinds of narcissist is the spiritual narcissist, someone who has recognized the higher dimensions of reality but has taken it to mean that they are special in some way. It might even be possible to say that narcissism is quite prevalent among the spiritually awakening and could characterize the stage described as the dweller on the threshold, the perfected threefold personality before it submits itself to the angel of the presence, the soul. The dweller on the threshold being aware of the spiritual realities, but still consumed with what happens to the individual self in connection with those realities. The angel of the presence not only understands theoretically, but also lives experientially the presence of many other angels, coexisting with the one greater angel. It is important that we know about narcissism because we are all now living collectively in a narcissistic society and are largely being ruled by individuals who display a high level of the disorder. This is immediately apparent to anyone who has observed the modus operandi of the governing elite and the power systems, politics, business and media that they represent. To fully understand how the current social, economic and political paradigm has come to be, it would most likely take a very detailed trip through world history, so suffice it to say that the main thrust of its development has been the consolidation of power in the hands of a few at the expense of the many. Had it been for the benefit of the many, we would have been living in a very different world today, but it would seem that the power holders we have had have been desirous of things, money, property, armies, countries and so on, outside themselves, reflections of themselves, however transient and insubstantial they may be, to proclaim to others their identity in the world or to feel better about themselves in some way. By now, as we are frequently told, these powermongers constitute approximately 1% of the global population and own more than 90% of the world's resources. The ruling elite have several tools with which to maintain control over the status quo. One of them is force, another is propaganda, and yet another is consumerism. Consumerism is a narcissistic phenomenon that was intentionally cultivated to gaslight the masses, populations of the world that is, who do not belong to the ruling elite. For most of our history, people accepted their position in life, or had no choice but to, and lived on what was needed rather than desired. By the 1920s, however, the ruling elite was beginning to get a little bit worried. The late 18th century had seen two major revolutions in France and America, which had overthrown the status quo. The 19th century had been an iconoclastic one, to say the least, with church, state and social structure being seriously challenged, and science exploding our understanding of physical reality. And the very recent 1917 revolution in Russia had once again seen the complete overthrow of its rulers. Cue the rise of consumerism. This was not an entirely natural consequence of the materialistic tendencies of human beings. It came as the result of a concerted effort by the ruling elite to increase goods consumption by the masses, not only to increase their own power and wealth, but to subdue or sedate the masses into an overriding preoccupation with identity-enhancing items which would quell any urge to rebel against those who held the power strings, who obliged the masses to work constantly to both produce and consume ever more consumables. A key player in this was Edward Bernays, the nephew of psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, and considered to be the father of public relations. He developed his approach during the First World War when he was helping the American propaganda effort. In peacetime, he saw the opportunity to convert this expertise in mass persuasion to the markets. Combining crowd psychology and psychoanalysis based on his uncle's theories, his basic idea was that the masses are irrational, that human behaviour is driven more by emotion than by logic, and that by harnessing that emotion at group level, you could get people, because they were subject to the herd instinct, to do what you wanted them to do. Working in collaboration with political, business and media agencies, he developed an approach whereby information presented to the public by an organisation was both advantageous to the organisation and also able to influence and control the masses as invisibly as possible. In his book Propaganda, he said, "If we understand the mechanism and motives of the group mind, is it not possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without their knowing about it? If you could convert active citizens into passive consumers, not only would you make your own wealth and power from them, but you would also control them in a very deep sort of way." In effect, Bernays was a key player in transforming a need-based society into a desire-based society, and he did this by linking products to the irrational forces in the human subconscious, which were unearthed by his uncle. For example, in his efforts to get women smoking, he called cigarettes torches of freedom and basically convinced women that smoking would in some way enhance their image and their lives. In the meantime, the consumer, individually and collectively, falls deeper and deeper into the stupor, the narcotic trance of materialism and the satisfaction of the psychophysical ego personality, and further from the soul, the true self, from the inner being which is connected with all other beings. What more graphic representation do we have of this than the rise of the selfie and the projection of reflections across social media in an attempt to convince others of their reality, of their perfect image or life? Narcissus gazing at his reflection in the pool. It might be difficult to establish a link between a psychological pandemic and a viral pandemic. For a start, we know relatively little about viruses. We don't fully understand how they transmit and mutate, neither do we know how they originated in the first place, or even whether they are strictly speaking living organisms or not. It might not, however, be too difficult to make an informed inference. Current research, for example, is showing that there is a link between environmental stress and the arising of viruses, a higher incidence of contagion, and a greater severity of symptoms occurring in areas that are more environmentally polluted. Now, what greater contribution to environmental pollution than the juggernaut of consumerism, embedded as a norm in the psyches of the ruling elite and the masses alike, with its rapacious exploitation of resources, its smokestack manufacturing methods, and a deluge of waste, much of it directly toxic, plastic for example, which is choking up not only the land, but the oceans and even space as well. Consumerism then has a direct and very obvious link to the planetary conditions in which viruses may well arise. And since consumerism represents a narcissistic strategy by the power elite to gaslight the masses into collective addiction to a restricted, three-dimensional version of reality where only what you can buy has any value, it is surely reasonable to suggest that the narcissistic mindset may have played its part in the current COVID pandemic. The story of Narcissus is really an account of what happens when a person refuses to awaken spiritually, when they remain in the sleepless slumber of materialism, cut off from their true self and therefore from their interconnectedness with all things and from love. Once we have seen through this illusory state, however, we have the choice of being caught up in the narcissistic meltdown or establishing and maintaining a connection to our higher being, which knows itself as interconnected with all other beings and wishes only the highest good for them. It is no longer about you and I, but about we, or even better, I and I.